So, last speaker, Joshua Corman. He's the founder of I Am Cavalry, and he's also the director of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative of the Atlantic Council. And he's a great knowledge and understanding of the combination of issues that we've discussed with the human aspects, with its regulation, and with its simulation to real life. So welcome, Josh.
Thank you. So I'm going to build on what the previous speaker said. I've grown deeply concerned about the relationship between technology and the human condition. About 4 years ago, I grew very worried that if you look at cybersecurity, our failure rate is about 100%. Think about it for a second. About 100 of the Fortune 100 have lost intellectual property and trade secrets over the last several years. Nearly every single one of us has had a compromised credit card. We're spending about $80 billion US per year on cybersecurity. And we essentially abdicated that we can't really prevent things. We're just going to detect and respond. That's one thing when it's a credit card, but what about the less replaceable items like public safety, human life, trust in key markets? Failures that affect GDP or national security. So about 4 years ago, I tried to ring the bell and call out that if the cavalry isn't coming, if our trust and dependence in technologies is growing faster than our ability to secure it in areas affecting public safety and human life, where bits and bytes meet flesh and blood, if no one's going to come save us, then we have to save ourselves. So at DEF CON, the largest hacker conference in the world, we essentially said, if the cavalry isn't coming, it falls to you to be a voice of reason, a translator, an educator, an ambassador, to work with the public sector, the public and safety critical industries to try to drive much more attention on high consequence failures. So what is a high consequence failure? It's not even a breach, it's not a loss of intellectual property. We haven't really had anyone go out of business due to a high consequence failure. We've had Ashley Madison lead to some suicides. We've had OPM and Pentagon attacks and nation state attacks, but nothing yet has sufficiently triggered a corrective action or the will to do something different. And the industry is essentially doing exactly what we incentivize them to do. So the problem with safety critical IoT is that these aren't simply markets, they're market enabling markets. And this isn't even a metaphor anymore. Software is now foundational to modern society. Steel and concrete, look at the ceiling. Did anyone sit here in perpetual fear all day long that this building would collapse on us and kill us? No, we depend upon it because it's dependable. But we're becoming as dependent on software as we are on steel and concrete, and it's nearly infinitely vulnerable. Now, we keep saying we're going to wait for things to stay as bad as they are until we have a catalyzing event that's going to trigger the political will to do something different. The problem is, if you'd recognize this picture, this is the Cuyahoga River in Ohio on fire. You had a burning river. How do you put out a burning river? Well, it turns out that having a river on fire from pollution wasn't enough to trigger a corrective action. This was the 22nd time the river had caught on fire across a 70-year period. So it's not that we're going to have one big failure that tells us we should get better. We're actually having a series of failures, and here's a few rapidly to remind us what we saw last year. So 2016 seems to be the turning of the tide. So while we've known for many years that you could hack critical infrastructure and power grids, we've now seen the Russians actually do it. Similarly, we know our water facilities, our oil and gas, our critical infrastructure can be exposed on things like Shodan, where you can easily find hard-coded passwords and internet-connected devices, and with no hacking skill whatsoever, you can manipulate things, and now we're seeing it done, at least in a few public cases. But the one that really got me, of all the safety critical industries, was to see Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital in Southern California last February have a single flaw in a single device without a deliberate adversary shut down patient care for 1 week. They had to cancel surgeries, divert ambulances to other facilities. When seconds matter, you had to go somewhere else. And it's one thing if it's one hospital, but it's entirely different when it's an entire system of hospitals. Now, many years ago, I researched the rise of chaotic actors in Anonymous, and people were pretty unimpressed with them. They weren't very talented, there weren't very many hackers, maybe it was a fad, but what I saw in it wasn't what they looked like when they were born, what I saw is this is the beginning of a trend. We called the series Building a Better Anonymous, and we researched for about a year and a half because what we saw in Anonymous was a blueprint that would be adopted and perfected by others. Now at the time, we didn't even have extremist groups like this, but a concern of ours was that people with a clearer and more extreme ideology would perfect the innovation of high intent, low capability adversaries, imposing their will on others. So while we talk a lot about nation states, I'm actually a lot more concerned about more extreme groups with very little talent, but a lot of willpower to use it. And it's kind of undeniable to look at the cyber caliphate and say that they have not picked up the blueprint of Anonymous. Now, this is not merely a metaphor. Of the very, very few hackers in the global movement, one of the hackers from Team Poison in the UK, from the Birmingham, UK, was arrested and went to jail for hacking Tony Blair's website. Now, at some point after leaving prison, he radicalized, left the UK, moved to Raqqa, Syria, and was a founder of the cyber caliphate before making his way to number 3 on the ISIS list and finding a drone missile strike, taking his life in August a couple of years ago. So what you have in Trick, Junaid Hussain, is someone with the means, motive, and opportunity to take life in cyberspace. He was not a very talented hacker, but talented enough to attack Windows XP in a hospital. So when February came around, I said to myself, thank God Trick is dead, because if an accident can take out a hospital, what could someone do on purpose? And we're so focused in the international policy community on norms and treaties and deterrence and offense versus defense between rational nation states, we've almost completely ignored the intersection of high intent, low capability adversaries with the willpower to use it. And when these attacks come, it won't be a quick fix because there isn't the infrastructure or the staff or the experience to deal with them quickly. This will be more like the BP oil spill in the Gulf, where it's just gushing on the news for days and weeks. Now, I spent the last year on a congressional task force for healthcare cybersecurity, and one of the things we asked ourselves is there any technical barrier to a sustained denial of patient care on any or all US hospitals or globally? And the answer was no. And as a founding premise, we had to look much more aggressively at how to make these systems more resilient. And again, when you talk about international diplomacy, we tend to focus on nation states because they are very talented. And our defense is so low that even if you doubled or tripled our defense, you're still not going to prevent yourself from being attacked. But what we ignore is the high intent, low capability adversaries. And when we don't take enough care for our cyber hygiene, for SMB on the internet, for patching a Windows vulnerability that's been around since March, we expose ourselves to a whole bevy of accidents and adversaries in entirely avoidable ways. And any one of these could trigger that crisis of confidence in the public to trust connected medicine. So while we tend to use norms and treaties and deterrence and economic sanctions for our nation-state adversaries, we could also focus on raising hygiene to make more defensible IoT, like Bruce talked about, to incentivize and encourage basic patching and hygiene. And while it will never stop a determined advanced persistent threat, we can't typically stop a script kiddie or someone using free attack tools. Now, we've had wave after wave of tsunamis of technical debt. Bruce referred to the Mirai botnet. This is one of the largest, I think it was 1 terabyte per second attack, using a fraction of its total attack capacity. If we ignore this long tail of low cost, low hygiene devices, we will get to a point of unstoppable attacks. And you can't look at IT or IT security as a market. It's a market enabling market. For the longest time, we've said if we regulate IoT, we might stifle innovation or hurt the economy. But what you're finding globally is policymakers realizing that if you fail to regulate IoT, we may stifle innovation or hurt the economy. So we're in some very uncomfortable areas. And it's one thing when it's doing a ransomware to lock up your data. It's another entirely when it's doing a denial of service attack. But there is destructive malware, which is just a different payload, which could destroy the device. In fact, a lot of people wanted to respond in Mirai by bricking or destroying these $110 cameras, which is okay when it's a disposable device. It's another entirely when the Internet of Things is a multi-million-dollar MRI machine in a hospital that's contributing to one of these botnets. The 3 distinguishing characteristics of Mirai were fixed passwords, internet connections, and unpatchable devices. I just described almost every single medical device. So the next Mirai botnet could not be composed of disposable IoT, but life-critical IoT hooked up to patients. In fact, one of our worst fears just happened a few weeks ago. WannaCry, without deliberately targeting healthcare, took out 65 hospitals in a single day in the UK. That was 20% of their entire capacity. So losing one hospital means you divert ambulances up the street, maybe a few blocks away. Losing every hospital means you have degraded and delayed patient care, and people will die and have died. Now, luckily, we had spent a year working on these really hard problems, and with a lot of candor, we put out our healthcare cybersecurity task force. And while a US-based task force, we have a global supply chain and global attack surface for most of these things. And I want to punctuate very quickly 5 of our uncomfortable truths we uncovered. Essentially, we see the situation as quite dire. In the US, about 85% of our hospitals lack a single qualified security person on staff. Forget security products or security monitoring. There's no one there to apply a patch or to take a warning from law enforcement. Number 2, they tend to be defending really old devices. Windows XP is often a best case scenario. So these are obsolete, unsupported, and much harder to defend. Number 3, the push towards electronic health records made so we have unsegmented networks where devices that were never designed to be connected to anything are connected to everything. It's often very common to see devices naked on the internet and exposed to accidents and adversaries like WannaCry. Number 4, a single flaw in a single device was sufficient to take out patient care for a week at Hollywood Presbyterian and for 20% of the capacity in the UK a few weeks ago. And the really bad news is the average medical device has over 1,000 known vulnerabilities. So the combination of these things means we have a lot of work to do, and many of these fixes will take a decade or more if we chose to do so today. But with Mirai right around the corner, we don't have time for that. With WannaCry knocking on our doorsteps, we're out of time. And normally we cry about there's no money, there's no resources, we can't possibly respond to this. But if we can't afford to protect it, why do we think we can afford to connect it? I'm not arguing we go back to the dark ages, but a crisis of confidence will cause chief medical officers and physicians to retreat from otherwise superior and life-saving technologies, and that's the real harm. It's not the number of deaths, it's the number of potential lives we could have saved if we had more confidence and trust. So lastly, I'll tie up here. We also, last 3 weeks ago, we did the first ever clinical simulation of hacking with real physicians in a real ER. We hacked 3 different devices with unwitting suspects using real actors and real dummies that you have organs and blood and respond the same way the human does. And they train them on exotic circumstances they'll encounter in the ER. Now, all 3 patients died. They all died gloriously. One died 3 times before they finally gave up. But the big takeaway is physicians are not trained for this. They can and will adapt once they understand to be skeptical of some of the technologies they depend upon. We're going to have this on Nightline in the next week or 2. We are working on this in the government, in the US and abroad, but we're starting now things that will take 5 to 10 years. And instead of looking at the fact that we're in bad shape, the question becomes how much political will do we have right now to deal with the next wave and then wave after that? Because while we got lucky with WannaCry, that luck will run out. The bell has been rung. Adversaries have seen this. There will be other waves, and we need to start acting now. So my closing thought is that through our overdependence on undependable things, we have created the conditions such that the actions of any single outlier can have a profound impact on our economic and national security. But mostly, we're bits and bytes, eat flesh and blood. We've had fires before. How many fires will it take before we have the will to do something? Thank you.
Hi, Josh. Thank you very much. So can you name one single most troubling observation or insight out of this simulation?
The simulation? Well, the things that made for good television were the 3 hacked medical devices. We had an insulin pump hack, a bedside infusion pump, which is in every single room in every single hospital in the world, and a defibrillator pacemaker. And while those made for great television, the really disturbing things were the tabletop exercises we did on day 2, where if you take out a single hospital or region, they can sort of cope with that, but if you take out 2, the whole system falls apart very quickly. So for me, the biggest takeaway is we need more simulations, more tabletops, more disaster recovery planning, so that we know what to do when these things happen and we can maintain the confidence of the public.
Very good. For me, the takeaway is be healthy.